Welcome to the Trad Dads Podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought. All right, tonight I'd like to talk about cooperatives and how they can be used to give us the proper economies of scale that we need to keep the cost of living relatively low, but also do a good job of comporting with Catholic social teaching and lining up with the principles laid out by Leo XIII and other subsequent popes on the issues of subsidiarity, solidarity, and the importance of property ownership by the public in general. So I want to start off by saying that cooperatives are a lot more common than you might think. So for me, as a rural guy, I normally think of cooperatives in the sense of agricultural cooperatives, and those are the types of cooperatives I've studied as an economist, and the ones that I interact with at least on a somewhat frequent basis. The ones that support the community that I live in and my family and things like that. So outside of the agricultural context, which is very important in the U.S. and was crucial, I think, in ensuring that cooperatives would be able to operate in terms of the legal framework in the U.S. There are a lot of other examples. So most of you have probably heard of a credit union. You may not belong to one, but you have probably heard of them. And credit unions are essentially banks that are owned by the people who borrow or deposit there. So they are cooperatives. They're financial cooperatives. A lot of times they will offer lower rates in terms of loans. So they allow people to get access to loans that they need for homes or vehicles or whatever, business loans. And the fact that you are an owner of that cooperative, you are a part owner of that cooperative, you get the benefits of ownership. The profits are returned to you. Ace Hardware is a co-op. So specifically, it is an input co-op, which means that all of these little mom and pop, or maybe slightly larger than mom and pop, hardware stores are members of this large cooperative called Ace Hardware. And instead of each of those relatively small businesses buying their inventory individually, they sort of band together and buy in bulk as a cooperative, and that allows them to get lower prices for those for their retail inventory. Another good example, I think, is rural electricity. So I have an old friend who is an engineer at a relatively large rural cooperative, and the cooperative he works for is actually made up of a whole bunch of smaller cooperatives that cover the western third of Kansas, maybe the western half. And since it would be difficult to convince a business to come out, or a for-profit corporation, or an investor-owned corporation, there we go. Since it might be tough to convince an investor-owned corporation to take that risk, essentially what you do is you create this co-op so that everyone who lives in that area has an ownership interest in the cooperative, and they can pool their money together to provide these sort of public good things like infrastructure for electricity. And so that brings me to Cenex Harvest States, which is an agricultural co-op to an extent, but it's also an energy co-op. If you've ever seen a Cenex gas station, spelled C-E-N-E-X, I don't know if they're not all over the country, certainly. We have them where I live now. But those gas stations are owned by Cenex Harvest States, CHS, which is a cooperative, a massive agricultural and energy cooperative that is also, like my friend like his rural electricity cooperative, is made up of smaller, more local agricultural co-ops. And the Cenex Harbor States is a massive, massive company. And it really is a great example, I think, of the way in which cooperatives can be used to, on the one hand, provide efficiency and economies of scale, but on the other hand, can also provide this ownership interest that's very important for us when we're thinking about Catholic social teaching and sort of the appropriate life of someone in relation to their community, right? This idea that property ownership should be common among lots of people instead of being concentrated in a relatively few hands. And of course, I think the typical example that a lot of people bring out when they're talking about distributism or whatever is the Mondragon Corporation in Spain. And I don't know a terrible lot about Mondragon, but I do know they have in the tens of billions of revenue every year. They are more of an employee-owned cooperative, which I'm going to get to the criticisms of co-ops later, but they're a little bit different than an input cooperative like Ace Hardware or a marketing co-op, which would be probably what you see a lot of in terms of agricultural co-ops. Those are owned by the customers, effectively. They're called the users or the patrons of the cooperative. But Mondragon is an employee-owned cooperative. And that's a little bit of a different type of thing, but the bottom line is still there, right? The idea is that you have ownership, and so that the profits of the business go directly to you as an owner in the business, not just as an employee or a patron or something like that. And so I think scale and ownership are two of the best reasons why we like cooperatives, why cooperatives are better, I think, in many cases than just strictly investor-owned corporations. There's another interesting margin on which cooperatives, I think, can be better than traditional investor-owned corporations, and that is the tax advantage they have. They are taxed differently from the way corporations face sort of double taxation. Co-ops face a kind of double taxation in some cases, but not in all cases. So many times cooperatives are afforded a little bit of a tax advantage over a traditional corporation. So at least in the U.S., I'm not sure about other countries, but I think that it's easy to see how a cooperative can foster subsidiarity and solidarity to a greater degree than an investor-owned corporation can. Cooperatives tend to be more tied to a specific community. Now, whether that's a physical location or whether it's a profession or something like that, I think that they have a little more buy-in than a corporation would, right? Because a corporation, especially a very large one, can sort of operate like a bank or a conglomerate, right? They can just simply go into whatever they want in terms of investment. But cooperatives, I think, just tend to have a slightly different attitude about things. So I just want to cover a few criticisms of cooperatives and sort of respond to those. And then, of course, any feedback that you have about this, any questions you have about cooperatives or comments that you want to make, maybe things you want me to address in the future, please hit us up on Twitter at TradDads, and let me know what I want to have a conversation with you. Or if you're on YouTube, put it in the YouTube comments. So one of the criticisms that we often hear with respect to cooperatives is that employee-owned cooperatives sound like this sort of post-Soviet pseudo-socialist kind of thing. And I think at least in the U.S., and I would say likely in Europe as well, I really don't understand this criticism because, for one, there's genuine ownership of the cooperative by either the patrons, right, the customers, or the employees. It's not a matter of a Soviet, right, the group, the organization, owning and controlling something, right? This is sort of the euphemism of Soviet sort of pseudo cooperative ownership or something. They really do own it, and they really do receive, the dividends from that cooperative, the profits of the cooperative. They might come in the form of equity, sure. We just increase your equity in the company rather than paying you out in cash. Though, there are requirements that cooperatives have to at least cover the cash, have to pay out enough cash so that the patrons can, patron owners can, meet their tax obligations and stuff like this. But it builds ownership. It builds equity. It builds community, and an authentic community. It makes it so that you have buy-in with the group of people that you're associating with in this co-op, whether it's for electricity use or agricultural or whatever. It helps to tie communities together. The fact that you have this ownership stake in this organization that's not easily sold. And I'll get to that more here in a second. But again, this idea that it's socialist is just weird. And I would say even in the management of the thing, cooperatives have CEOs. They have a fairly typical management structure, a lot like, an investor-owned corporation. And even the corporate governance, the relationship between the owners, the many owners, and the relatively few, C-suite executives, is very similar. The owners of the cooperative elect a board of directors, and that board of directors meets with the CEO and his close subordinates on a regular basis to, again, govern the management of the corporation. Of the cooperative. It's very similar to just any old investor-owned corporation. So this idea that they're somehow, akin to or related to these, communist, co-ops is just silly. Another is low capital mobility. And so, if you dig into finance much, or I guess financial economics much, you'll learn about things like the efficient markets hypothesis, which is this idea that, financial markets can only correctly price assets if certain conditions are met. And one of these things is that there's high liquidity in the market, right? That anyone who wants to sell or buy in to that specific asset at any time can pretty much do so. And cooperatives don't have, cooperatives aren't listed on the New York Stock Exchange, right? The equity for that company, the ownership stake in those companies is a lot more, is just illiquid. It's difficult to obtain or difficult to get out of. But that's not necessarily a bad thing in my mind. It goes back to some of these other analogies I've talked about. It's sort of like Social Security, right? So Social Security, in my mind, and I've spoken about this in previous episodes, but Social Security, it had within it the seeds of its own undoing, because it undermined the public's will to look backward at the previous generation and provide for them. And it also, because it broke families up in this way, it helped, I think, reduce the fertility rate of, the U.S. and probably Europe as well, among other causes, I'm sure. And So it's one of these things where, yeah, okay, it sounds like a good idea, but then it undoes itself. And I think, this is a similar type of thing. I mean, you look at the failure rate of corporations over time, and most don't last, a few decades at the most, right? So the returns that you would get over a very long period of time in the stock market, if they're coming from a single company, that it's very few of those companies. Really, your returns are coming from, riding a certain wave of a company being successful and then getting out before it dies. And so cooperatives are, by the fact that they are illiquid, the equity is illiquid, by the fact that it is difficult to buy in or sell easily. It's not easy to do that. That constraint builds community. That constraint helps us understand that, we have a commitment to a place. We have a role in the place we are. And I mean, we have a previous episode, and maybe I'll link to this, but a previous episode about family versus rugged individualism is one of our more popular episodes, and I think this fits in very well with that. So I'll link that in the show notes. And the last one is that cooperatives. Okay, yeah, sure, maybe they're nice for marketing your wheat or whatever, but they really can't get to the scale that we need. And I think, again, my response is kind of twofold here. Number one, I will disagree. And number two, I'll say that, gosh, even if you're right, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. So to disagree, I would just point to organizations like Cenex Harvest States, or Mondragon, or some of these, rural cooperatives. I mean, some of them, the ones that are cooperatives made up of cooperatives, federated cooperatives is what they're called. They are quite large. If you've ever bought Land O'Lakes butter, you have bought from a very, very large cooperative. These organizations are not small. Now, are they as big as McDonald's? No. But gosh, if you want to talk about something that has the ability to squash the unique characteristics of a community, let's talk about very large companies. McDonald's, okay, to some extent, yeah, sure, when they go from one country to another, they change their menus, but the food in different places in the U.S. is different all over the place. And these restaurants, these very large corporations, provide a level of consistency that just drives out uniqueness. And so I guess I'm not convinced that having uniformity across a massive swath of the population is necessarily a good thing. Pushed on us, I guess, in a sense, by corporations like this. I don't see why that's such a good thing necessarily. So, yeah, we like scale to an extent because we need it for efficiency, but good grief, let's not trade that off too much against uniqueness and our commitment to the place we are in, the unique culture of the place we live in. So just to sum up, I think cooperatives can be a very good alternative. I think they're underutilized. I think when we really dig in and find out the wide array of businesses that are supported by cooperatives, and the types of things that they do, Ace Hardware, I mean, who would have known, right? So we've got energy, we've got agriculture, we've got, retail, we've got banking, a lot of different things could be handled by cooperatives. And they are a way of achieving scale, reasonable scale, with an attitude that sees the importance of community and distributed ownership. And I hate to use the phrase distributed or the word distributed, but we want lots and lots of people to own the means of their own well-being, and that is the very opposite of socialism that folks get smeared with all the time from the liberal types. So thank you for listening. Again, I appreciate our supporters. If you'd like to support us, you can go to anchor.fm/traddads and donate. We have a monthly donation option there. We're also running ads, if you haven't noticed, and so we are able to get some ad revenue. We don't have a whole lot yet, but hopefully we will get some more popularity. So the best thing you can do for us is to share our podcast with people you think that might be interested in it. Please check us out on your favorite app or on YouTube. And with that, God bless. Thank you. As you know, we could use more voices on the traditionalist right. And one of the best ways to do that is with a podcast. I've been using Anchor.fm for this podcast and for another podcast for over a year, and I've really enjoyed it. It's free, and it allows me to upload clips and also to record and edit. It also disperses all of my podcasts to all the major platforms, including Apple Podcast and Spotify. It also allows me to monetize and to collect donations. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. If you want to join me in being a voice for the traditionalist right, download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.